The fastest way to lose everything is to believe you're better than someone you've never met. The boarding process had already started when Victoria Sterling stepped onto the jet bridge with the confidence of someone who had spent most of her life getting exactly what she wanted. At 48 years old, she was known in business circles for her luxury fashion brand, her polished interviews, and her ability to command attention the moment she entered a room. Dressed in an elegant cream-colored designer suit and carrying a handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent, she moved through the first-class cabin without even glancing at the other passengers. In Victoria's world, people were often sorted into categories within seconds: important or unimportant, useful or forgettable, worth noticing or worth ignoring. As she reached row 2, she stopped. Her smile faded. Sitting beside her assigned seat was a black man in his early 40s, quietly reading a hardcover book while waiting for departure. He wore dark jeans, a simple navy sweater, and a silver watch that looked ordinary from a distance. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing that demanded attention. His carry-on bag rested neatly beneath the seat in front of him. His expression was calm, almost relaxed, as though flying across the country was the least interesting part of his day. The man briefly looked up and offered a polite nod. "Good morning." Victoria did not return the greeting. Instead, she stared at her boarding pass, then at the seat number, then back at him. For several uncomfortable seconds, she simply stood there. Other passengers continued settling in around them. A flight attendant smiled and asked if she needed assistance. Victoria lowered her voice, though not enough to keep nearby travelers from hearing. "There must be some mistake." The flight attendant glanced at the boarding pass. "No, ma'am. Everything appears correct." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "I specifically booked this seat weeks ago." "Yes, ma'am. Seat 2B. The attendant maintained her professional smile. Victoria looked again at the man beside the window. He returned his attention to his book without saying a word. Something about his calmness seemed to irritate her even more. She shifted her designer handbag onto her shoulder and exhaled sharply. "I'd prefer another seat." The attendant remained courteous. "Unfortunately, first class is fully booked today." Victoria looked around the cabin as if expecting someone to fix the situation immediately. No one moved. No one volunteered. For the first time that morning, she seemed genuinely frustrated. Meanwhile, the man by the window simply turned a page and continued reading. His name was Marcus Johnson. And although nobody on that airplane knew it yet, the next 24 hours would change both of their lives in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, clearly trying to keep the situation from becoming uncomfortable for everyone nearby. "I am sorry, ma'am, but there are no other available seats in first class today." Victoria crossed her arms. Then perhaps someone should be upgraded or downgraded. Several passengers glanced in her direction. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. What had started as a routine boarding process was quickly becoming something people could not ignore. Marcus remained focused on his book. He neither looked up nor reacted. His calm silence only seemed to make Victoria more irritated. "Did you hear me?" she said, turning toward the flight attendant. "I paid for a premium experience." "And you have received the seat you purchased, ma'am," the attendant replied politely. Victoria shook her head. "That is not the point." Marcus slowly closed his book and looked up. His expression remained composed. "If it helps, I am perfectly comfortable staying where I am." His voice was steady and respectful. Victoria stared at him for a second before looking away. "I was not speaking to you." A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks. One man across the aisle raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The flight attendant attempted to move things along. "Ma'am, boarding will be completed shortly. We do need passengers seated before departure." Victoria lowered herself into the aisle seat with obvious reluctance. The moment she sat down, she shifted as far away from Marcus as possible. She placed her handbag between them as though creating a barrier. Marcus simply reopened his book. For several minutes, neither spoke. Outside the window, baggage crews moved across the tarmac while the last passengers boarded. Then Victoria pulled out her phone. Although the aircraft doors had not yet closed, her voice carried farther than she seemed to realize. "I cannot believe this," she muttered. "After everything I spend with this airline." She opened an email and began typing rapidly. Marcus noticed nothing. Or at least he appeared not to. The woman sitting directly behind them could clearly hear every word. So could the businessman across the aisle. Victoria continued typing complaints, occasionally glancing toward Marcus with visible disapproval. What frustrated her most was not his presence. It was his complete lack of reaction. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not even appear offended. It was as if her opinion carried no weight in his world. That realization bothered her more than she cared to admit. A few moments later, the captain welcomed everyone aboard over the intercom. Passengers settled into their seats. Phones were switched to airplane mode. The aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate. As the engines began to hum beneath the cabin floor, Victoria looked out the window and exhaled sharply. Marcus turned another page in his book. Neither of them knew it yet, but several people on that flight had already started paying attention. And before the day was over, the person most determined to judge a stranger would become the center of a story far larger than a seat assignment on an airplane. 20 minutes into the flight, the tension around row 2 had not disappeared. If anything, it had quietly spread through the cabin. Most passengers had returned to their own activities, but many remained aware of the uncomfortable dynamic unfolding between Victoria Sterling and the man seated beside her. Victoria attempted to focus on her tablet, yet every few minutes her attention drifted back to Marcus Johnson. She could not understand him. Most people would have reacted by now. They would have looked offended, frustrated, or at least uncomfortable. Marcus showed none of those things. He simply continued reading, occasionally making notes in the margins of his book with a small pen. The calm confidence in his behavior felt strangely unsettling. Victoria finally broke the silence. "Are you traveling for business?" Marcus looked up from the page. "Yes." "What kind of business?" she asked. "A meeting." His answer was polite but brief. Victoria waited for more. Nothing came. "That sounds vague." Marcus smiled slightly. "Most meetings are not very interesting to talk about." The response was harmless, yet Victoria felt dismissed. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman glanced up from his laptop, sensing the conversation. Victoria leaned back in her seat. "I travel constantly for work. I am speaking at a conference tomorrow." Marcus nodded. "That sounds important." "It is." She paused. "Thousands of people follow my company." Marcus offered another courteous nod before returning to his book. Once again, the conversation ended on his terms without any argument or confrontation. Victoria stared ahead, increasingly annoyed. About 30 minutes later, beverage service began. A flight attendant approached their row with a cart. "Can I get either of you something to drink?" Victoria ordered sparkling water. Marcus requested coffee. A few moments later, the attendant accidentally bumped the cart while serving another passenger nearby. The sudden movement caused a cup to tip, sending a small amount of coffee onto Marcus's sleeve. Several people looked over immediately. "I am so sorry, sir," the attendant said, clearly embarrassed. "That was entirely my fault." Marcus glanced at the stain and smiled. "It is no problem. Accidents happen." The relief on the attendant's face was immediate. "Please allow me to bring you another drink." "Thank you. I appreciate that." The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but several nearby passengers noticed something important. Marcus treated the employee with the same respect he had shown everyone else. No anger. No complaints. No attempt to embarrass her. Victoria watched the interaction in silence. For reasons she could not explain, it bothered her. She had spent the entire flight evaluating Marcus based on assumptions. Yet every piece of evidence in front of her seemed to contradict those assumptions. Meanwhile, the woman sitting directly behind them quietly opened her phone and sent a text message to a friend. She described the scene she had witnessed since boarding. Not because she expected anything dramatic to happen, but because something about the contrast between the two passengers felt impossible to ignore. One seemed determined to prove superiority. The other seemed completely uninterested in proving anything at all. And as the aircraft continued its journey across the country, more people were beginning to decide which person had earned their respect. About an hour into the flight, the seatbelt sign illuminated unexpectedly as the aircraft encountered a stretch of rough air. The cabin shook gently at first, then more noticeably. Drinks rattled on tray tables. Several passengers looked up from their devices. A nervous murmur spread through the cabin. Across the aisle, an elderly woman traveling alone tightened her grip on the armrest. She appeared anxious even before the turbulence began, and now she looked genuinely frightened. The flight attendants quickly took their seats as instructed. Victoria glanced briefly toward the woman before returning her attention to her tablet. Marcus noticed something different. The elderly passenger was struggling to reach a small medication bottle that had slipped from her lap and rolled beneath the seat in front of her. Because everyone had been instructed to remain seated, she could not safely stand to retrieve it. She looked around uncertainly. Marcus immediately understood the problem. Without making a scene, he leaned slightly forward from his seat and carefully used his foot to stop the bottle before it rolled farther down the aisle. Then he reached out and guided it back toward her with the handle of his carry-on bag. The woman smiled with obvious relief. "Thank you so much," she said. "You are very welcome," Marcus replied. "Are you doing all right?" She nodded. "I just do not enjoy flying very much." Marcus smiled. "Most of us are just passengers trusting physics and a very well-trained crew." The comment drew a few quiet laughs from nearby travelers. Even the woman seemed to relax. For the next several minutes, Marcus spoke with her calmly whenever the turbulence increased. He never left his seat. He never ignored safety instructions. He simply helped keep her mind occupied until the ride smoothed out again. The atmosphere in the cabin gradually relaxed. Several passengers who had witnessed the exchange exchanged approving looks. The businessman across the aisle gave Marcus a subtle nod of respect. The woman behind them smiled to herself. Victoria noticed all of it. What irritated her was not that Marcus had helped someone. It was how naturally he had done it. There had been no performance. No attempt to attract attention. No expectation of praise. He had simply seen a person who needed help and responded. A few minutes later, the elderly woman thanked him again. "You have been very kind." Marcus shrugged lightly. "We all need help sometimes." Those words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Victoria stared out the window, suddenly feeling disconnected from the admiration building around him. The more people seemed to appreciate Marcus, the more determined she became to maintain her original judgment. Yet the facts in front of her continued moving in the opposite direction. Every interaction reinforced the same impression. He was thoughtful, patient, respectful. Meanwhile, her own behavior during boarding remained fresh in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. As the aircraft continued toward its destination, a quiet shift was taking place. Marcus still appeared to be an ordinary traveler. No one knew anything significant about his career, his finances, or his influence. But without realizing it, he had already earned something far more valuable from the people around him. He had earned their trust. And before the flight was over, that trust would make the next events even more unforgettable. As the flight moved past the halfway point, most passengers had settled into a comfortable routine. Some watched movies, others worked on laptops, and a few slept beneath light blankets. Yet the quiet tension surrounding Victoria Sterling had not disappeared. In fact, it seemed to be growing. The more respect Marcus earned from the people around him, the more isolated Victoria felt in her own row. She noticed the occasional glances from nearby passengers. She noticed how warmly the elderly woman smiled whenever she looked toward Marcus. She noticed how the flight attendants appeared genuinely happy to assist him. None of it made sense to her. In Victoria's experience, influence was usually visible. Important people made sure everyone knew they were important. Marcus did the opposite. That contradiction continued to bother her. Eventually, she pressed the call button above her seat. A flight attendant arrived moments later. "How may I help you, ma'am?" Victoria lowered her voice, but several nearby passengers could still hear portions of the conversation. "I would like to speak with the lead flight attendant." The employee maintained a professional expression. "Certainly." A few minutes later, the lead attendant arrived. Victoria immediately began explaining her concerns. She carefully avoided saying anything that might sound openly offensive, but her meaning was clear enough. She described being dissatisfied with her seating arrangement. She suggested that the airline had failed to meet her expectations. She emphasized her loyalty as a frequent customer. Throughout the conversation, Marcus remained focused on his book. He did not interrupt. He did not react. The lead attendant listened patiently before offering the same answer Victoria had already received. Every seat in first class was occupied. There would be no changes. Victoria forced a smile. "I see." But her disappointment was obvious. After the attendant left, she opened her tablet and began drafting another complaint. This time it was longer, more detailed. She mentioned names, flight numbers, customer loyalty status. She seemed determined to create consequences for someone. Meanwhile, a young passenger a few rows back approached the elderly woman Marcus had helped earlier. The two exchanged a brief conversation before both glanced toward row 2. Word was spreading through the cabin, not because Marcus had sought attention, but because people naturally talked about acts of kindness. The irony was impossible to miss. Victoria had spent hours trying to separate herself from the man beside her. Yet more and more passengers seemed interested in him rather than her. A short time later, Marcus closed his book and looked out the window. The afternoon sunlight illuminated the clouds below. He appeared completely at peace. Victoria glanced toward him again. For a moment she seemed as though she wanted to say something. Instead, she looked away. Deep down, she sensed that the opinions forming around her were changing. The problem was that she believed status could always control perception. She still thought reputation could protect her from consequences. What she did not realize was that the people watching her were beginning to form conclusions of their own. And before this journey ended, those conclusions would matter far more than she imagined. The flight was now less than 2 hours from landing when a small detail finally appeared that neither Victoria Sterling nor most of the passengers fully understood. It happened during a routine cabin check. One of the senior flight attendants walked through first class carrying a tablet. As she approached row 2, her expression suddenly changed. It was subtle, almost invisible, but not invisible enough. She looked at Marcus Johnson, paused for half a second, then smiled with what appeared to be genuine recognition. "Good afternoon, sir," she said warmly. "Is there anything else we can do for you today?" The question itself was ordinary. The tone was not. Victoria noticed immediately. So did the businessman across the aisle. Marcus looked up from the document he had been reviewing and returned the smile. "No, thank you. Everything has been excellent." "We are very glad to hear that." The attendant nodded respectfully before continuing down the aisle. Victoria watched her leave. Something about that interaction felt different from the way airline employees normally treated passengers. It was not fear. It was not forced politeness. It looked more like professional respect. A few minutes later, another flight attendant approached with a fresh cup of coffee. "Compliments of the crew, sir," she said. Marcus appeared surprised. "That is very kind, but unnecessary. Please enjoy it." She smiled and walked away before he could object. Victoria stared at the cup. She had spent years flying first class and rarely saw anything complimentary offered without a specific reason. The questions forming in her mind grew louder. Who exactly was this man? Yet every clue seemed to lead nowhere. Marcus did not wear expensive jewelry. He did not talk about business deals. He had not mentioned any prestigious title. His clothes were simple. His behavior was ordinary. Nothing matched the attention he seemed to receive. Several rows behind them, the passenger who had been texting friends about the events on board quietly snapped a photo of the clouds outside her window and shared an update about the flight. She briefly mentioned the calm man in first class who had helped an elderly traveler and remained gracious despite obvious tension from another passenger. The message was harmless. She had no idea it would later become relevant. Meanwhile, Marcus opened a folder from his briefcase. Victoria caught only a brief glimpse before he turned it slightly away. She managed to read a few words printed across the top page. Strategic Partnership Summit. Beneath that appeared several company logos she recognized immediately. They were large organizations. National organizations. Her attention sharpened. Marcus calmly reviewed a few pages, made notes with a pen, and then closed the folder again. Nothing about his demeanor suggested he was trying to impress anyone. In fact, he seemed completely unaware that people were observing him. That quiet confidence unsettled Victoria more than open success ever could. By now, she wanted answers. But asking direct questions would require admitting her curiosity. Instead, she continued watching from the corner of her eye. The aircraft cruised steadily above the clouds while the mystery surrounding Marcus deepened. The passengers still believed he was simply a kind traveler. Victoria suspected there was more. The truth was that both assumptions were incomplete. And when the full picture finally emerged, nobody in that cabin would see it coming. As the aircraft continued toward its destination, curiosity about Marcus Johnson quietly spread through the first-class cabin. The clues were there, but they refused to form a complete picture. He was clearly educated, clearly respected. Yet nothing about him matched the stereotype many people associated with powerful executives. He did not speak loudly. He did not name-drop influential contacts. He did not spend the flight announcing accomplishments. Instead, he seemed content reading documents, helping strangers, and enjoying the journey. That simplicity made him difficult to categorize. Victoria Sterling found herself paying closer attention than she wanted to admit. Several times she glanced toward the folder resting on his tray table. Each time she caught only fragments. Meeting schedules. Notes. Names of organizations. None of it revealed enough to satisfy her growing curiosity. Finally, she broke the silence again. "You seem very busy for someone who says his meetings are not interesting." Marcus looked up and smiled politely. "Most important work is less exciting than people imagine." Victoria studied him. "You travel often?" "Often enough." "For your company?" Marcus paused briefly before answering. "For several organizations." The response was accurate, yet somehow revealed almost nothing. Victoria frowned. "You are remarkably careful with your answers." Marcus chuckled softly. "Years of practice, I suppose." Before she could continue, a man seated across the aisle leaned over slightly. "I hope you do not mind me saying this," he said to Marcus, "but that was kind of you earlier with that elderly passenger." Marcus nodded. Anyone would have done the same. The businessman shook his head. "Not everyone." The conversation ended there, but the comment lingered. More than one passenger quietly agreed. Over the next 30 minutes, the atmosphere in the cabin became noticeably warmer toward Marcus. Flight attendants greeted him by name when passing through. Passengers smiled when making eye contact. The elderly woman even waved from several rows away before returning to her crossword puzzle. Victoria noticed every interaction. She also noticed something else. Nobody seemed interested in her anymore. Earlier in the flight, her complaints had commanded attention. Now those same moments appeared to have produced the opposite effect. The people around her had observed both passengers for hours. They had watched how each handled inconvenience, uncertainty, and other people. Without realizing it, everyone had been conducting the same comparison. Then another small clue appeared. A flight attendant approached Marcus carrying a message printed on airline stationery. "A representative from the airport requested that this be delivered to you upon arrival," she said quietly. "They asked us to ensure you received it personally." Marcus thanked her and folded the note without reading it immediately. Victoria's eyes followed the paper. Airport representatives did not normally send personal messages to ordinary travelers. The mystery deepened once again. Yet the truth remained hidden. The passengers believed Marcus was some kind of successful professional. Victoria suspected he might be more influential than that. Neither assumption was entirely correct, because the reality waiting on the ground was far stranger than anyone imagined. And within a few short hours, The decisions made in this cabin would collide with events unfolding far beyond the airplane, creating consequences that no passenger could possibly predict. The captain announced that the aircraft would begin its descent in less than 40 minutes. Passengers started organizing their belongings and finishing last-minute work. Outside the windows, the afternoon sky stretched endlessly across a blanket of white clouds. Inside the cabin, however, one question remained unanswered. Who was Marcus Johnson? Victoria Sterling had spent most of the flight constructing theories. Perhaps he was a wealthy investor. Perhaps he owned one of the companies listed in the documents she had glimpsed. Perhaps he was some influential executive traveling quietly to avoid attention. Every clue seemed to point in that direction. Then, without warning, those assumptions began to fall apart. The businessman across the aisle finally introduced himself. "I am David Reynolds," he said. "I have been trying to figure out what industry you are in all day." Marcus laughed. "You are not the only one." "So, what do you do?" David asked. For the first time during the flight, Marcus gave a slightly more detailed answer. "I work with organizations that help companies build long-term partnerships." David nodded slowly. "Consulting?" "Not exactly." "Investment management?" Marcus shook his head. "No." Victoria listened carefully while pretending not to. David continued. "Corporate strategy?" Again Marcus smiled. "Not really." The answers surprised everyone within earshot. None of the categories seemed to fit. "Then what exactly is your position?" David finally asked. Marcus paused for a moment before responding. "Most days, I spend my time helping different groups decide whether they can trust each other." David blinked. "That sounds unusually important." Marcus chuckled. "Sometimes. Most of the time it means sitting in meetings for hours." The conversation drew a few smiles, but it also created more confusion than clarity. He was not claiming to be a chief executive officer. He was not presenting himself as a billionaire investor. He was not describing himself as a celebrity entrepreneur. In fact, he seemed almost determined to minimize his own significance. Victoria found this impossible to understand. Every successful person she knew advertised their accomplishments constantly. Marcus appeared completely uninterested in doing so. A few minutes later, David returned to his laptop. The mystery remained unsolved. Yet, something important had changed. The version of Marcus that Victoria had imagined no longer existed. He was not the flashy millionaire stereotype she had quietly assumed. He was not the famous executive she expected. Whatever role he played, it was something different. Something harder to define. Marcus looked out the window as the aircraft began descending through the clouds. His reflection appeared briefly in the glass. Calm. Focused. Unbothered. Victoria folded her arms and stared ahead. She felt frustrated by how little she knew about the man seated beside her. More importantly, she was beginning to realize that she might have misunderstood him from the very beginning. What she did not know was that the biggest revelation was still ahead. The truth was not that Marcus secretly owned a company. The truth was far more dangerous to her future than that. Because waiting on the ground was a decision involving millions of dollars, hundreds of jobs, and the future of an entire corporation. And Marcus Johnson was one of the very few people who could influence how that decision would end. The wheels touched the runway with a gentle thump, and a wave of movement spread through the cabin. Seatbelts remained fastened, but passengers were already reaching for phones, checking messages, and preparing for whatever awaited them on the ground. Victoria Sterling immediately powered on her phone. Within seconds, notifications flooded the screen. Emails. Calendar reminders. Messages from executives. Updates regarding the conference she planned to attend the following morning. Everything appeared normal. Everything appeared under control. Beside her, Marcus Johnson remained in no hurry. He waited patiently while the aircraft taxied toward the gate. He reviewed a few notes, closed his folder, and placed it neatly inside his briefcase. The contrast between them remained striking. Victoria was focused on schedules and appearances. Marcus seemed focused only on being prepared. As the aircraft finally arrived at the gate, passengers stood and began collecting their belongings. The usual rush toward the aisle followed. Victoria was among the first to step into the line. She wanted to leave quickly. The flight itself had been frustrating, and she was eager to put it behind her. Then something unexpected happened. A uniformed airport representative appeared at the front of the cabin. "Excuse me," he said. "Before passengers begin deplaning, I need to locate Mr. Marcus Johnson." The words immediately drew attention. Several passengers looked around. The businessman across the aisle glanced toward Marcus. The elderly woman looked up from her seat. Even Victoria turned her head. Marcus calmly raised a hand. "That would be me." The representative smiled. "Good afternoon, sir. We have arranged transportation as requested, and your meeting materials have already been delivered to the conference center." "Thank you," Marcus replied. "I appreciate it. The team is looking forward to seeing you." Marcus nodded politely. The exchange lasted less than 20 seconds, yet it changed the atmosphere instantly. People who had spent hours wondering about him now had another clue. Whatever his role was, it clearly involved people waiting for him. Important people. Organized people. Victoria listened carefully, but the information still did not answer the question she cared about most. What exactly did Marcus do? As passengers finally began leaving the aircraft, Marcus stepped aside to allow others to exit first. The elderly woman thanked him again for his kindness during the flight. David Reynolds shook his hand and wished him luck with his meetings. Several passengers offered friendly smiles as they passed. Marcus returned every gesture with genuine warmth. Victoria watched the scene unfold. She could not remember the last time she had seen complete strangers respond to someone with that level of respect. Yet, even now, she convinced herself that none of it mattered. She still believed the truly important events would happen at the conference. She still believed she was walking toward another successful business opportunity. What she did not realize was that Marcus was headed toward the exact same destination. And while Victoria saw herself as a key figure in the discussions ahead, Marcus occupied a position she had not even considered possible. Within the next few hours, their paths would cross again. When they did, the assumptions that had guided Victoria throughout the entire flight would begin collapsing one by one. By early evening, the conference hotel buzzed with activity. Executives, investors, nonprofit leaders, and corporate representatives filled the lobby, preparing for the Strategic Partnership Summit scheduled to begin the next morning. Victoria Sterling arrived with her usual confidence. She had attended events like this for years. Her company had built a recognizable brand, and she expected the upcoming meetings to strengthen several important business relationships. As she crossed the lobby, multiple attendees greeted her by name. The familiar attention reassured her. Whatever strange experience she had endured on the flight was now behind her. This was her environment. These were her people. After checking into her suite, Victoria reviewed her schedule. One meeting stood above all the others. A potential partnership agreement that could significantly expand her company into new markets. The project had been discussed for months. If approved, it would become one of the most important deals in her firm's history. Several board members were counting on it. Investors were watching closely. Success would strengthen her position even further. Failure would create difficult questions. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus Johnson arrived at a much smaller hotel. There was no luxury motorcade, no public announcement, no special treatment. He checked in quietly, thanked the staff, and spent the evening reviewing briefing materials. On the surface, his accommodations appeared modest compared to Victoria's. Yet the documents spread across his desk told a different story. Reports, financial projections, risk assessments, independent evaluations. Page after page of information connected to organizations participating in the summit. Marcus studied every detail carefully. Several recommendations would be made during the next 24 hours, and those recommendations carried enormous weight. Back at the conference hotel, Victoria attended a private networking reception. Conversations flowed easily. Champagne glasses clinked. Business cards exchanged hands. During one discussion, an executive mentioned that final partnership approvals would depend heavily on an external review committee. Victoria nodded confidently. She already knew that. What she did not know is who actually sat on the committee. "Do you know who will be leading the evaluations this year?" someone asked. Another executive shrugged. "Nobody seems to know much about him." "Him?" Victoria asked. "The committee chair," the man replied. "Apparently he keeps a very low profile." The comment sparked brief curiosity before the conversation moved on. Yet something about it stayed in Victoria's mind. The next morning arrived quickly. Hundreds of attendees filled the conference center. Large screens displayed schedules and keynote sessions. Staff members moved efficiently through the hallways. Victoria entered one of the main meeting rooms expecting another routine day of presentations and negotiations. Then she noticed something unusual. Several senior executives she respected appeared nervous. Not stressed. Respectfully nervous. Almost as though they were waiting for someone important to arrive. Victoria followed their gaze toward the front of the room. The seat reserved for the committee chair remained empty. A small nameplate sat on the table, partially obscured by a stack of documents. She could not read it from where she stood. But within minutes, the identity of the person occupying that chair would finally be revealed. And when it happened, every assumption she had made since boarding the airplane would begin unraveling at once. The room gradually fell silent as attendees took their seats. Conversations faded. Laptops opened. Presentation screens glowed at the front of the hall. Victoria Sterling adjusted her notes and glanced once more toward the empty chair reserved for the committee chair. Around her, experienced executives waited with unusual patience. Whatever authority this person held, it was clearly significant. Then the side door opened. Several organizers entered first, exchanging brief greetings with attendees. A moment later, another figure stepped into the room. Victoria looked up casually. The moment she recognized him, every thought in her mind seemed to stop. Marcus Johnson walked calmly toward the front of the room. He wore the same understated confidence he had carried throughout the flight. No entourage. No dramatic entrance. No attempt to command attention. Yet the reaction around the room was immediate. Senior executives stood to shake his hand. Conference directors greeted him warmly. Several people who had spent decades in business treated him with unmistakable respect. Victoria stared in disbelief as Marcus reached the front table and took the seat beneath the nameplate. For the first time, she could read it clearly. Marcus Johnson. Chair, Independent Partnership Review Council. Her stomach tightened. She had expected a billionaire founder, a famous chief executive officer, a celebrity investor. Instead, the man she had spent hours dismissing on the airplane occupied a position even more important to her immediate future. Marcus was not applying for approval. He was helping determine who received it. The conference director stepped to the microphone. "Before we begin, I would like to thank our review council and especially Mr. Johnson for his leadership throughout this year's evaluation process." Applause filled the room. Victoria remained frozen in her seat. The director continued. "As many of you know, the council has spent months reviewing partnership candidates, assessing financial sustainability, organizational culture, long-term impact, and leadership credibility." Leadership credibility. The phrase echoed in Victoria's mind. Marcus listened quietly while the introduction continued. Nothing about his expression suggested triumph or satisfaction. In fact, he appeared completely focused on the work ahead. The presentation began. One by one, organizations were discussed. Recommendations were reviewed. Questions were answered. Throughout the process, Marcus demonstrated the same qualities passengers had witnessed during the flight. He was calm, thoughtful, respectful. He listened carefully before speaking. When disagreements emerged, he focused on facts rather than personalities. Every comment reflected preparation and discipline. The more Victoria watched, the worse she felt. By mid-morning, she realized something devastating. Marcus had likely recognized her company name the moment he arrived. He almost certainly knew who she was. Yet he had never mentioned it. Never confronted her. Never embarrassed her. While she had spent hours judging him, he had simply treated her with courtesy. Then the agenda reached the item Victoria had been waiting for. Her company's proposed partnership appeared on the screen. The room grew attentive. Investors leaned forward. Board members exchanged looks. Millions of dollars and years of planning depended on what happened next. The director turned toward Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, would you like to present the council's findings?" Marcus opened a folder, glanced briefly at the report, and prepared to speak. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. Because for the first time since boarding that airplane, she understood exactly how much influence the man beside her had always possessed. The next morning began with a series of conversations that Victoria Sterling never expected to have. By sunrise, the consequences of the previous day's decision were already spreading through her company. Several investors requested clarification regarding the concerns raised during the review process. Board members demanded a strategy meeting. Industry reporters began asking questions about the rejected partnership. None of these developments were catastrophic on their own. The problem was that they were all happening at once. Victoria arrived at an emergency board meeting determined to regain control of the situation. She entered the room expecting support. Instead, she found concern. The directors seated around the table were not focused on the lost opportunity itself. They were focused on what had caused it. One board member spoke first. "The partnership was important, but that is not the issue anymore." Another nodded. "The review council's findings are being discussed throughout the industry." A third director added, "People are questioning whether our leadership culture matches the values we promote publicly." Victoria attempted to defend the company's record. She highlighted growth figures, successful product launches, and years of strong performance. But every argument led back to the same question: trust. The concern was no longer about revenue. It was about credibility. During a break, Victoria checked her phone and noticed a message from a colleague who had been on the same flight. Attached was a social media post written by one of the passengers. It described a first-class traveler who had repeatedly complained about sitting beside another passenger who later turned out to be widely respected at a major conference. The post did not mention names, yet the details were recognizable. Hundreds of comments had already appeared beneath it. Most focused on the same lesson: never judge people based on appearances. Victoria felt a knot form in her stomach. The situation was evolving beyond business metrics and boardroom discussions. It was becoming a reflection of character. By late afternoon, the board reconvened. After several difficult hours of discussion, the directors reached a conclusion. The company would begin a leadership restructuring process. Victoria would remain temporarily involved during the transition, but her authority would be significantly reduced while the board conducted a broader review. The announcement felt unreal. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had considered herself untouchable. Now decisions were being made without her approval. The position she had spent years building was slipping away. Yet even then, nobody blamed Marcus Johnson. His report had not created the underlying problems. It had merely exposed them. As Victoria left the building that evening, she finally understood the painful truth. The opportunity had not been lost because of a single meeting. The trust had not disappeared because of a single report. Those outcomes were the result of choices made repeatedly over time. The flight had simply forced her to see the same pattern in a more personal way. For the first time in years, she began questioning not what had happened to her, but why it had happened at all. 3 weeks later, the headlines had faded. The conference had ended. The board review had been completed. Victoria Sterling was no longer serving as chief executive officer of the company she had spent years building. The transition had been professional and orderly, but the outcome was undeniable. Leadership had changed. Investors had supported the decision. The company moved forward under a new structure designed to rebuild trust both internally and externally. For the first time in decades, Victoria found herself living without the constant certainty that status would solve every problem. During those weeks, she replayed the flight in her mind more times than she could count. Not the board meetings. Not the conference presentations. The flight. She remembered standing in the aisle. She remembered the assumptions she had made within seconds of seeing Marcus Johnson. She remembered deciding who he was before learning a single fact about him. The memory became impossible to ignore because it reflected a much larger pattern. Eventually, Victoria made a decision. She requested a meeting with Marcus. She did not expect him to accept. To her surprise, he did. They met in a quiet coffee shop on a weekday afternoon. There were no cameras, no reporters, no executives, just two people sitting across from one another. Marcus arrived exactly as she remembered him. Calm, professional, unhurried. After a few moments of conversation, Victoria finally said what she had wanted to say since the conference. "I owe you an apology." Marcus listened without interrupting. "I judged you before I knew anything about you," she continued. "And the truth is, I had been doing that with people for a long time." Marcus remained silent for a moment before answering. "Most people make assumptions. The important question is whether they are willing to challenge them." Victoria nodded slowly. "I wish I had done that sooner." What surprised her most was that Marcus showed no interest in making her feel worse. He did not lecture her. He did not revisit the details of the flight. He did not use the opportunity to settle a score. Instead, he spoke about leadership, responsibility, and the importance of treating people with dignity regardless of their position. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, Victoria felt something she had not experienced in a very long time: humility. As they prepared to leave, she asked one final question. "When you realized who I was at the conference, why did you never mention the flight?" Marcus smiled. "Because the meeting was never about me." Victoria looked at him quietly. Marcus picked up his coat and prepared to leave. Then he added one final thought. "People rarely lose opportunities because of one bad day. They lose them because small choices reveal bigger patterns." He paused before opening the door. Character is what people discover after the titles disappear. With that, he walked away. Victoria remained seated for several minutes, reflecting on everything that had happened. The flight had started with a seat assignment. It had ended with a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. Because in the end, the most valuable thing Marcus Johnson possessed was not authority, influence, or professional success. It was the ability to see the humanity in people before deciding what they were worth. And that was something no title could ever replace.